The room was already loud when the words fell, sharp and clear, cutting through laughter like glass. The aunt did not raise her voice, which made it worse. She smiled, lifted her glass, and said it as if it were a joke everyone should enjoy. She called the protagonist a failure. Then she praised her son and said he had a real career. The table went still. Plates clinked once, then stopped. Every eye turned. The protagonist felt the heat rush to their face but kept their posture calm. They had learned that reacting only fed moments like this. Inside, though, something twisted hard. This was not teasing. This was a public verdict. The aunt had chosen the stage and the timing with care. A family dinner. A full table. Witnesses. The protagonists scanned the faces around them. Some looked down. Some pretended to sip water. No one spoke. The aunt leaned back, pleased, her words hanging in the air. She had always enjoyed control, enjoyed shaping stories until they served her pride. Tonight, she wanted a clear winner. The son sat beside her, shoulders tight, eyes on his plate. He did not smile. He did not protest. He did not even glance up. That silence hit the protagonist harder than the insult, because they remembered the nights that led here, the calls made in secret, the promises whispered with shame. Years earlier, the protagonist's life had broken apart without warning. A job ended. Savings thinned. Friends faded. They rebuilt slowly, step by step, working jobs no one praised, learning skills no one saw. They stopped explaining themselves because explanations never helped. Survival became quiet and private. Then, the son had called. He had sounded different then. Small, careful. He said his plans had failed. He said debts were piling up. He said he needed a chance, any chance, and he asked if the protagonist could help. The protagonist had paused, knowing what help would cost. They had still said yes. They trained him. They covered mistakes. They kept his past hidden so he could stand tall again. They signed the checks that kept his lights on and his pride intact. They never asked for credit. They never told the family. It wasn't leverage. It was trust. Now the aunt spoke as if that past never existed. She tilted her head and added more, dressing her insult in concern. She said some people just didn't have drive. Some people wasted time chasing ideas. She said stability mattered. She said hard work showed results. The protagonist listened. Each word stacked like weight on their chest. They felt the old fear, the one that whispered they would always be misunderstood. But something else rose with it, steadier and colder. The truth. Clean and sharp. The aunt waited. She wanted tears or anger. She wanted proof she was right. The protagonist lifted their eyes and met hers. The room felt smaller, airtight and thin. They spoke slowly, clearly, without edge. I signed his paycheck. The sentence was simple. It landed heavy. A breath passed. Then another. Someone coughed. The aunt's smile froze. Her eyes flicked toward her son, then back. She laughed once, short and unsure, as if the room had missed a joke. The son's face drained of color. The protagonist said nothing more. They didn't need to. The truth sat there on the table, quiet and solid. It didn't shout. It didn't egg. It waited. The aunt's laughter faded. She straightened, searching for words, but none came that would fit. Her story had cracked. Not enough to break fully, but enough for everyone to see the line. Conversation stumbled back to life in pieces. Someone asked about dessert. Someone stood to refill drinks. The dinner continued, but the warmth was gone. The protagonist ate little, feeling watched from the edges. They noticed how the sun avoided their eyes, How the aunt spoke louder than before, forcing cheer. How no one asked questions. Family had always preferred comfort over truth. As the night dragged on, the protagonist felt the weight of years settle in. All the times they had swallowed insults to keep peace. All the moments they had been measured by visible success while their quiet work went unseen. This was not a single cut. It was a long pattern, now exposed. When the dinner finally ended, chairs scraped back. Coats were pulled on. Goodbyes were quick and stiff. The aunt hugged others warmly and skipped the protagonist without pause. The sun lingered, then left without a word. Outside, the air was cool and still. The protagonist stood alone by their car, hands resting on the door, breathing slow. The night hummed with distant traffic. Their reflections stared back from the window, older, steadier, tired. They did not feel victory. Not yet. What they felt was clarity. The aunt had not made a mistake. She had chosen to belittle someone she believed was safe to hurt. The son had chosen silence to protect his image. The family had chosen comfort over fairness. And the protagonist had chosen truth. As they drove away. Memories replayed fast and sharp. The phone call asking for help. The first paycheck signed. The promise made without witnesses. Those choices had shaped this moment. Power had shifted, whether the family admitted it or not. The protagonist realized something important as the house lights faded behind them. Revenge was no longer an idea born of anger. It was now a question of balance, of respect, of what should be done when the truth is known and ignored. They drove on. Jaw set, thoughts racing, knowing this dinner was not the end of the story. It was the beginning. The days after the dinner passed like a low hum in the background of the protagonist's life. But the tension never left. Every morning, they woke with the memory of the aunt's words, the weight of the insult pressing against their chest. They replayed the scene in their mind repeatedly. The aunt's smirk, the silence of the son, the shocked looks of the family. That calm, simple declaration, "I signed his paycheck," was not enough. The truth had been spoken, but it had landed like a stone in water. Ripples spread, but nothing seemed to change. The protagonist felt a surge of power at first, but it was mixed with unease. The thought of revenge was intoxicating. They imagined emails sent, contracts revoked, the son forced to scramble for survival just as he had once done. The aunt, with her smug certainty, finally undone, forced to face her own arrogance. Every scenario played like a movie in the protagonist's mind, fast and vivid, each scene more satisfying than the last. They envisioned a dinner table where roles reversed, where they could finally sit back and watch the justice unfold. But alongside the thrill was a gnawing question. Was that truly justice, or just cruelty dressed up as satisfaction? The son became a central figure in this internal battle. Every interaction with him now carried weight. When emails arrived with polite questions, the protagonist noticed the hesitations, the careful wording, the small mistakes left out of nervousness. He had grown complacent on the comfort the protagonist provided. And now, seeing the aunt's influence, he seemed smaller, more fragile than the confident image he projected. It would be easy to pull the rug out. One phone call, one signature, and his career could collapse. No one would question the protagonist's right after all. They had built the career from the ground up. Yet, something restrained them. They remembered the man who had arrived at their door years ago, head bowed, ashamed, afraid of judgment. They remembered the nights spent mentoring him, the risks taken to protect him from embarrassment. That same person, fragile and human, was now sitting under the weight of his mother's praise, unaware of how close he had come to failure again. The thought of hurting him felt like stabbing a mirror, cutting someone who reflected the protagonist's own past struggles and compassion. Revenge felt heavier now, complicated, less clean. The protagonist's thoughts became a battlefield. Each day they weighed options, walking a fine line between wrath and restraint. They imagined the thrill of exposing the truth, of shattering illusions the aunt had spent years creating. But then they envisioned the fallout: family tension, guilt, regret, and possibly a son who would resent them instead of learning the lesson intended. They questioned their own motivations. Was this about justice, or was it about pride? Was satisfaction worth the cost of peace? Plans began forming. The protagonist considered subtle ways to assert power without destroying. They could correct the narrative quietly, ensuring the truth of their contribution was known. They could remind the son privately, firmly, of the work that had given him a second chance. They could confront the aunt indirectly, without public humiliation, letting her see her arrogance reflected back subtly through consequences, not insults. Each approach required patience, timing, and strategy, a game of chess rather than a sword fight. The protagonist had never enjoyed games before, but this one promised both precision and moral clarity. At work, their focus sharpened. Every decision, every interaction became part of the unfolding plan. They monitored the son's progress, looking for moments to guide, correct, and reveal without creating resentment. They thought about emails carefully, considering which facts to present and which to withhold. They visualized the aunt's reaction to subtle truths leaking into conversations, imagining her realization that control was an illusion. Every choice carried weight. One misstep could create unnecessary drama, or worse, harm the son. The psychological toll was heavy. Nights were restless. Dreams were filled with the aunt's laughter and the son's nervous glances. The protagonist felt the tension tighten in their chest, imagining the perfect moment to act. Yet, every potential action was measured against a mental question. Would this serve justice, or simply feed pride? This struggle became almost daily, cycling through exhilaration, doubt, and careful reflection. The protagonist understood that revenge promised emotion, but peace required self-control. The hardest part was knowing the moment to act could be now or never. Meanwhile, small provocations tested them. A phone call from the aunt, innocuous at first, contained a subtle jab, hidden in tone. Social media posts flaunting the son's success stung silently. Even casual remarks from relatives praising the son as the real achiever sharpened the hunger for retaliation. The protagonist fought to keep their expression neutral, to hide the storm beneath a calm exterior. Inside each provocation fed the mental calculation of options. Patience was now as vital as power. One wrong move could expose emotion too early, tipping the balance. The protagonist's internal debate became an emotional roller coaster. They imagined confronting the aunt directly with undeniable truth, proof of the son's reliance, evidence of their contributions. That confrontation promised satisfaction, but also carried risk. The aunt's stubborn pride, family backlash, and the irreversible change in relationships. The son's well-being hung in the balance. Every plan required imagining outcomes, consequences, and the possibility of unintended harm. They realized revenge was never simple. It was layered with psychology, morality, and long-term impact. Days turned into a rhythm of preparation and reflection. The protagonist's desire for revenge sharpened focus, demanding creativity, patience, and strategic thinking. But every plan was tempered with moral consideration. They drafted emails, considered phone calls, and rehearsed conversations, imagining each word's effect. They learned to separate desire from action, hunger from wisdom. The goal shifted subtly, not to destroy, but to correct, to assert truth, and to remind the son and eventually the aunt of reality without crossing ethical lines. The protagonist began to see patterns. The aunt's need for control, the son's dependence on perception, the family's avoidance of confrontation. They all created openings. But the key was timing. They waited for moments when truth could emerge naturally, when the son would understand fully without being humiliated, and when the aunt would feel the subtle consequences of pride rather than explicit shame. Every step of planning became an exercise in self-discipline, balancing emotional satisfaction against long-term integrity. Amid this, the protagonist's reflection deepened. They realized revenge could be destructive, a temptation that promised momentary satisfaction, but often left regret in its wake. They also recognized the unique position they held, power mixed with responsibility. The son's career could be affected, the aunt's influence challenged, but both could be approached with wisdom instead of impulsive fury. Their minds sharpened around one guiding principle: action must honor truth, not ego. Finally, a decision began to crystallize. The protagonist understood that satisfaction didn't always come from exposing weakness publicly or punishing arrogance directly. Sometimes the most powerful action was quiet, deliberate, and invisible. It was the son learning respect and integrity, without humiliation. It was the aunt facing subtle consequences without drama. It was the protagonist reclaiming control without sacrificing peace of mind. Revenge no longer seemed like a violent act, it became a measured, almost surgical correction of imbalanced. And so the stage was set. Days of tension, reflection, and planning coalesced into clarity. The protagonist felt the pulse of potential, action in their hands, understanding both its weight and its consequences. The desire for revenge was still there, sharp and bright, but it no longer dominated. It became a tool, guided by patience, ethics, and strategy. The path forward was no longer about anger. It was about control, about teaching, about asserting truth without creating destruction. The protagonist knew the critical moment was approaching. The decision would not be easy, but preparation had built confidence. They had measured risk and reward, considered morality, and tested emotions. The son's next steps, the aunt's reactions, and the family's assumptions all hung on the edge of a delicate balance. The question was no longer whether to act, but how to act with precision, wisdom, and restraint. And so, the protagonist waited, alert and ready, aware that the climax of this struggle was near. The plan had taken shape, the psychological groundwork laid. Every interaction, every observation had been part of this build-up. The son would soon understand his dependence and responsibility. The aunt would eventually face consequences, subtle but undeniable. And the protagonist would finally confront the choice that had been growing inside them, to use the power for destruction, or for something far more profound: truth, correction, and controlled resolution. The day of decision arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. The protagonist sat at their desk, hands resting on the smooth surface, eyes fixed on the documents in front of them. It was routine: a meeting request, a review of accounts, a few signatures to approve. But beneath the ordinary, tension coiled like a snake. One move could change everything. One choice could destroy, or one could correct. And the weight of that knowledge pressed heavily on their chest. Every second ticked with purpose. The son was on the call schedule, unaware of the storm swirling in the protagonist's mind. He would arrive, polite as always, calm on the surface, but fragile under pressure. The protagonist pictured his face, the subtle lines of worry, the small gestures of hesitation. He was reliant, yes, but not ungrateful, not cruel. That made the power all the more dangerous and the responsibility unbearable. It would have been easy to revoke the job, to expose the truth, to show the aunt and the family who had really built the son's career. But the protagonist paused. This was no longer about ego. It was about integrity and the consequences of action. The phone rang. Calmly, the protagonist answered, voice steady, welcoming, masking the internal storm. The son's voice came through, cautious, polite, unaware that his fate rested in the next few minutes. The protagonist listened carefully, noting tone, hesitation, choice of words. Everything was normal, mundane, but beneath it, the power of truth sat quietly, waiting. Every word they spoke, every confirmation they gave, could tilt the balance. The son's career, the aunt's perception, the family's assumption, all rested on the protagonist's discretion. Minutes stretched. The protagonist's mind raced, calculating outcomes. Destroying the son's career would be a sharp, immediate thrill, a flash of justice. They imagined the aunt's shock, the reversal of roles, the satisfaction of exposing arrogance. But even as the thought crossed their mind, an image returned, the young man at their door years ago, ashamed, afraid, desperate for a chance. Hurting him now would be an echo of the aunt's cruelty, a repetition of humiliation. It would bring satisfaction in the short term, but it would leave a hollow weight that lingered. Instead, the protagonist shifted strategy. They leaned forward, speaking clearly, firmly, without threat, without accusation. They reminded the son of the opportunities granted, the trust placed in him, and the work required to maintain that trust. Every word was a gentle boundary, a lesson wrapped in responsibility. The son listened, silent, absorbing the gravity without panic. No drama, no anger, just clarity. The protagonist felt the tension ease slightly, knowing the son would now understand his place without fear, without humiliation. The call ended. Silence lingered in the room, thick and heavy. The protagonist leaned back, exhaling slowly, feeling the mental weight lift just a fraction. They reflected on the power they held, on the temptation to wield it for destruction, and on the strength required to act with wisdom instead. Revenge had promised exhilaration, but restraint promised something far more satisfying: control, clarity, and moral balance. They had chosen not to destroy, and yet the balance had shifted. Lessons had been delivered, trust had been reinforced, and the aunt's influence was subtly undermined without confrontation. Days passed, and the aftermath revealed the depth of the choice. The son carried himself differently, more confident yet humble, aware that privilege and opportunity came with responsibility. He began to speak with clarity, to make decisions independently, to acknowledge quietly the guidance and support he had once taken for granted. The protagonist observed this transformation with a careful satisfaction, a quiet approval. The lesson had been delivered. The consequences were clear, and yet there was no bitterness, no drama, no public spectacle. Everything had unfolded with precision. The aunt, meanwhile, never apologized, never acknowledged her arrogance, but her behavior shifted subtly. The protagonist noticed it in small interactions: hesitation in her tone, careful consideration before speaking, an unspoken awareness that control was not absolute. The subtle consequence of pride revealed itself without confrontation. The protagonist understood that justice did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, shaped outcomes quietly, and created more lasting effect than anger or revenge ever could. Power wielded wisely became invisible influence. Reflecting further, the protagonist realized the true lesson of the experience. Revenge, while tempting, often carries collateral damage that lasts longer than any momentary thrill. The desire to humiliate, to expose, to reverse roles is powerful, but it can trap one in cycles of anger and regret. The choice to act with precision, with measured intent, and with ethical boundaries created satisfaction that was deeper, more durable, and aligned with integrity. The protagonist understood that real control lies not in destruction, but in shaping outcomes without succumbing to base impulses. Family interactions continued, but the balance had subtly shifted. Conversations around the aunt carried a quiet acknowledgement of the protagonist's strength, though unspoken. The son's behavior, respectful yet independent, became a reflection of the quiet authority and guidance he had once rejected or ignored. The protagonist felt a calm satisfaction that did not require validation, applause, or revenge. The power they held had been exercised not through public spectacle, but through measured moral action. The experience had changed them. It had sharpened insight, strengthened patience, and clarified the line between vengeance and justice. Even alone, the protagonist reflected on the journey. They remembered the dinner, the insult, the hush of the family, the moment of revelation with a simple phrase. I signed his paycheck. They remembered the internal battle, the temptation to destroy, the analysis of every potential outcome. They remembered the weight of responsibility, the potential consequences, and the ultimate choice to act with precision, guidance, and moral balance. The thrill of revenge had been tempting, seductive, powerful, but the satisfaction derived from restraint, strategy, and ethical action was far more profound. Though ultimately, the protagonist understood a universal truth. Power without wisdom is dangerous, but wisdom applied to power shapes reality in subtle, lasting ways. They had faced the desire for revenge, measured the outcomes, and made a choice that reinforced truth without destroying relationships or integrity. They had held the sword of influence and chose to wield it carefully, quietly, decisively. The aunt's arrogance, the son's reliance, and the family's assumptions had been addressed not with anger, but with moral clarity. Lessons had been delivered, consequences applied, truth asserted. In the final reflection, the protagonists smiled quietly to themselves, alone in the calm after tension. The son had learned responsibility. The aunt had faced subtle consequences. Family dynamics had shifted without spectacle. And the protagonist, above all, had exercised power ethically, navigating the tension between desire and morality with precision. Revenge had been contemplated, examined, and ultimately transcended. They had chosen a higher path. Satisfaction was not in retribution, but in controlled, deliberate, and morally sound action. They had reclaimed not only authority, but peace, and the quiet knowledge that true influence is measured not by destruction, but by wisdom.